The carriage wheel snapped in half, and Alina Whitmore was thrown against the door with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. Rain hammered the roof. Horses screamed. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the storm, and then the whole carriage tilted sideways into the mud with a groan of splitting wood. Alina grabbed the seat and held on, her heart slamming against her ribs, certain the next lurch would send her tumbling into the ditch below. The door was wrenched open from outside. A gloved hand reached in through the driving rain. "Take my hand now." She did not stop to ask who he was. She grabbed the offered hand and was pulled out into the storm, boots sinking into cold mud, rain plastering her hair to her face. A tall man in a dark coat steadied her against his side as the carriage groaned once more and slid fully into the ditch behind them, wheel spinning uselessly in the air. "You could have been killed," the man said, half shouting over the wind. "Are you hurt?" "I do not think so." Her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "My father's shop. I was carrying the order for Lady Ashford's household. It will all be ruined now." Something in his face changed at the mention of the name, though she did not notice it in the dark and the rain. He guided her toward a second carriage waiting further up the road, its lanterns glowing gold through the downpour, and helped her inside before climbing in across from her and rapping twice on the roof. Only when they were moving, dry and sheltered, did she get her first proper look at him. He was younger than she expected, with sharp gray eyes and dark hair soaked flat against his forehead. His coat, even wet, was clearly the coat of a wealthy man. He studied her the way a person studies something they cannot quite believe is real. "You are Edmund Whitmore's daughter," he said. It was not a question. Alina stiffened. "You knew my father." "I know his shop. I have had coats mended there. Fine work." He paused. "I am sorry. I did not think to introduce myself before pulling you out of a ditch. Alexander Ashford." The name landed like a stone in still water. Duke Ashford. She had delivered mended garments to his estate more times than she could count, always through the servant's entrance, always handing the parcel to a footman, and leaving before anyone important could see her muddy hem or work-worn hands. She had certainly never expected to be sitting across from him in his own carriage, dripping onto his velvet seats. "Your Grace," she said, straightening despite the cold water running down her collar. "Forgive me, I did not recognize you." "There is nothing to forgive. You were rather busy not dying." A faint smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came. "Where is your father's shop? I will see you home myself." "That is not necessary." "It is entirely necessary. Your carriage is in a ditch, and it is raining as though the sky has taken personal offense at us both. I insist." She wanted to refuse again, out of pride, out of the strange discomfort of owing a duke anything at all. But the cold had crept into her bones and the shop was still a mile off, and so she gave the direction and settled back into the seat, watching the rain streak sideways across the window. He did not speak again for a while, and she was glad of it. Her mind was still catching up with what had happened, the crack of the wheel, the tilt of the world, the stranger's hand in the dark. When she finally looked up, she found he was watching her, not rudely, but with a kind of quiet attention she did not know how to read. "You delivered a coat to my house last winter," he said. "Gray wool, the sleeve had torn at the elbow." Alina blinked. "I do not recall the particular coat, Your Grace. My father mends a great many." "You mended it yourself. I saw you leaving as I came down the stairs. I offered to pay you directly since you had done the work, and you refused. You said the coin belonged to the shop, not to you." He said it lightly, but there was something underneath the words, some old memory he had kept longer than she would have guessed. "I have not forgotten it." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and watched the lights of the town approach through the rain. The shop, when they reached it, was dark except for a single candle burning in the back window. Her father would be waiting, worried sick by now that she had not returned with the deliveries. Alina reached for the door handle before the carriage had fully stopped. "Miss Whitmore," his voice stopped her. "The ruined order, I will make it right with the household. You are not to worry over it." "You do not need to do that." "I know I do not need to." He said it simply, without any weight of obligation, as though it were merely a fact he had decided upon and did not require her permission to act on. "Good night. I am glad you are not hurt." She stepped down into the rain, and by the time she turned to thank him properly, the carriage door was already shut and the horses were moving away down the wet street, lanterns swinging, until they disappeared around the corner and left her standing alone in the dark outside her father's shop, water dripping from her sleeves, wondering why her heart was still beating so fast. Inside, her father was exactly as worried as she had feared. Edmund Whitmore was a thin man made thinner by years of struggling to keep the shop from ruin, his hands stained with dye and his eyes red from close work by poor light. He rushed to her the moment she came through the door, checking her arms and face for injury before she had even managed to close the door behind her. "The carriage," she said before he could ask. "The wheel broke on the North Road. I am fine, truly. The Duke of Ashford happened to be passing and brought me home." Her father went very still. "The Duke himself?" "Yes." "And the order, Lady Ashford's gowns?" Alina's stomach dropped, remembering the parcels still sitting in the wrecked carriage, likely soaked through and ruined beyond saving. She had worked 3 weeks on those gowns. The payment for them was meant to cover the shop's rent for the coming month, money they did not have to spare. "He said he would make it right," she said, though she did not fully believe it herself. Dukes said many things. They did not always mean them, and even when they did, their idea of setting a matter right rarely matched the desperate arithmetic of a struggling shop. Her father sat down heavily at the work table, running a hand over his face. "We cannot afford to lose that payment, Alina. The landlord has already given us until the end of the month." She had known things were bad. She had not known they were that bad. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because there was nothing you could do about it except worry, and you already worry enough for the both of us." He tried to smile and failed. "Go and get dry. We will think of something." "We always do." But that night, lying awake and listening to the rain finally soften against the roof, Alina was not thinking of the rent, or the ruined gowns, or even the wrecked carriage. She was thinking of gray eyes in the dark, and a voice that had said, "I have not forgotten it," and wondering why a duke would remember a torn coat sleeve mended by a shop girl he had spoken to for perhaps 2 minutes, more than a year ago. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like that noticed things and forgot them just as easily. By morning, he would have moved on to matters far more important than a shopkeeper's daughter and her father's debts, and she would go back to her needle and thread and never think of him again. She was wrong on every count, though she would not learn how wrong for some time yet. 3 days passed with no word from Ashford House, and Alina had almost convinced herself. She had imagined the whole strange encounter when a smart carriage stopped outside the shop just after noon, and a footman in fine livery stepped down and knocked on the door with the particular confidence of a man who works for someone important. "A letter for Mr. Edmund Whitmore," he said, holding out a sealed envelope, thick paper. A wax seal pressed with a crest Alina recognized from every parcel she had ever delivered to that grand house. Her father broke the seal with trembling fingers while Alina hovered close, trying not to look as anxious as she felt. He read it once, then again, his frown slowly softening into something like disbelief. "He has paid for the ruined order in full," her father said quietly, "and commissioned a new set of gowns besides, 6 of them, for his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess." He looked up at Alina, and there was something searching in his gaze that she did not entirely understand. "He asks that you personally oversee the fittings, at the house." Alina's stomach turned over strangely. "Me? Why me?" "The letter does not say." Her father set it down on the counter, still frowning, though it was a thoughtful frown now rather than a worried one. "It only says he trusts your work and would prefer the daughter of Whitmore's to attend to it directly." It was, on its surface, an entirely reasonable request. She had done fine needlework for the household before. There was no scandal in a duke requesting good service from a shop he already patronized. And yet something in the careful, deliberate wording of it made Alina's pulse quicken in a way she did not want to examine too closely. She told herself it was simply the relief of the debt being cleared. the shop saved from ruin for at least another season. She told herself that 6 new gowns for the Dowager Duchess meant steady work and steady pay for weeks to come, and that was reason enough to feel her heart lift. She did not let herself believe, not yet, that it might have anything to do with gray eyes in the rain, and a voice that had remembered a torn coat sleeve for over a year. But that evening, as she laid out her sewing basket and measuring tape for the morning's visit to Ashford House, her hands would not quite stop trembling, and she found herself thinking, against every sensible instinct she possessed, that she was rather looking forward to seeing him again. Ashford House rose out of the morning mist like something from a painting, gray stone and tall windows, gardens stretching in every direction further than Alina could see. She had delivered parcels to the servants' entrance 100 times before, but she had never once walked through the front door, and when the butler opened it for her without a flicker of hesitation, as though she were an expected guest rather than a tradesman's daughter, she felt entirely out of her depth. "Miss Whitmore," the butler's voice was warm despite its formality, "His Grace is expecting you, if you would follow me." His name, she would learn within the hour, was Mr. Pemberton, and he had served the Ashford family for nearly 30 years. He led her through a hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, past a staircase wide enough to fit her father's entire shop, and into a bright morning room where sunlight fell across polished floors and Alexander Ashford stood waiting by the window. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression eased, as though he had been more anxious for her arrival than he wanted to admit. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming." "Thank you for the commission, Your Grace, and for settling the account. You did not need to be so generous." "I have been told that before, and I will say to you what I said then. I did not need to. I wished to." He gestured toward a settee near the window, where a length of pale blue silk had already been laid out, along with a sketchbook of design ideas. "My grandmother is difficult to please and even more difficult to fit properly. She has strong opinions about sleeves. I thought you might manage her better than the tailor I usually employ, who spends most of the appointment agreeing with everything she says and getting nothing done." Alina could not help the small laugh that escaped her. "I have fitted difficult customers before, Your Grace. I am not easily talked out of pins in the wrong place." "Good. I suspect you and my grandmother will get on rather well, then." He was not wrong. The Dowager Duchess, when Alina was brought to her private sitting room, turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman wrapped in shawls despite the mild weather, who studied Alina from head to foot with the frank appraisal of someone who had long ago stopped caring what anyone thought of her bluntness. "So you are the girl who mended Alexander's coat and would not take his money for it," the Duchess said, before Alina had even finished her curtsy. Alina straightened, caught off guard. "I did not think it right to charge extra for work already covered by the shop's fee, Your Grace." "HMPH, most people would have taken the coin and said nothing." The Duchess waved a thin hand toward a chair. "Sit. Show me these designs my grandson has apparently been fussing over for a full week, as though I have not worn a gown in 80 years and cannot be trusted to choose my own sleeves." It became clear within the first quarter hour that the Duchess enjoyed the fitting far more for the conversation than for the gowns themselves. She asked Alina pointed questions about the shop, about her father, about how a girl learned such fine needlework, and listened to every answer with the sharp attention of someone gathering information for a purpose she did not yet reveal. Alina answered honestly, pinning fabric as she spoke, and found, to her own surprise, that she rather liked the old woman's directness. "Alexander tells me you refuse to let the household pay above the fair price for the ruined order," the Duchess said at one point, watching Alina's hands work. "Is that true?" He offered more than the work was worth. It did not seem honest to accept it. "Honest?" The Duchess repeated the word slowly, as though testing its weight. "There are not many people left in this house who use that word about money, certainly not the ones who come here hoping to marry into it." She fixed Alina with a look that seemed to see straight through her. "You are not one of those, are you?" "I have no interest in marrying anyone, Your Grace, least of all above my station. I have a shop to keep and a father to look after," "A pity," the Duchess murmured, so quietly Alina almost missed it, and turned the conversation to sleeves once more before Alina could ask what she meant by it. Alexander appeared toward the end of the fitting, ostensibly to check on his grandmother's comfort, though the Duchess remarked dryly that he had never once checked on her comfort during a fitting before this particular seamstress had arrived. He ignored the comment with the ease of long practice, and instead asked Alina, with careful casualness, whether she would be willing to return the following week to finish the set. "Of course, Your Grace, it is a substantial commission. It will take several visits." "Good," he said, and there was something in the quickness of his answer that made his grandmother's eyebrows lift very slightly, though she said nothing more about it. Alina returned the following week, and the week after that, and by the fourth visit it no longer felt strange to walk through the front door of Ashford House, or to sit across from the Duke, while his grandmother tested silks against the window light and asked pointed questions about Alina's opinions on everything from the price of thread to the state of the roads. Alexander began finding reasons to be present for more of each visit: a letter that needed his grandmother's opinion, a report from the estate steward, a book he had been meaning to return to the sitting-room shelf, reasons that grew progressively thinner and more transparent, until even Alina, who tried very hard not to notice, could not help but notice. It was on the fifth visit that everything changed. Alina arrived to find the household in a state of hushed, careful movement, servants speaking in low voices. The usual brightness of the halls dimmed somehow, though nothing seemed outwardly different. Mr. Pemberton met her at the door with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Miss Whitmore, His Grace asked that I bring you to him directly if you do not mind. The Duchess is unwell. Her stomach dropped. Is it serious?" "The physician believes her heart is failing, Miss Whitmore, slowly but failing all the same." Mr. Pemberton's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed real grief. "She has been with this family a very long time." Alina followed him to the same morning room where she had first been introduced to Alexander, and found him standing exactly where he had stood that first day, though everything about him seemed different now. His shoulders set with a tension she had not seen before, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though he needed something to hold onto that was not falling apart. "Your Grace, I am so sorry." "She has known for months," he said without turning. "She did not tell me. I only learned yesterday from the physician, because she finally admitted she could not hide the fainting spells any longer." He exhaled slowly, and when he finally turned to face her, his composure had returned, though it was clearly costing him something to hold it there. "She has one wish, a single thing she has asked of me before she goes, and I find I do not know how to give it to her honestly, and I cannot bear to refuse her at all." "What does she ask?" "She wishes to see me settled, married. She has asked it of me for years, and I have always put her off, telling her there was time, that I had not yet met anyone I wished to marry." He met Alina's eyes then, and something in his expression made her chest go tight with a feeling she could not name. "There is no time now. And there is no one I could marry within the weeks she may have left, not truly, not with any honesty in it." Alina's mind raced ahead of her, understanding what he was about to ask before he asked it, and feeling something close to panic rise in her throat. "Your Grace, I would not ask this of you if I could think of any other way," he said quickly, as though he needed to get the words out before his own nerve failed him. "But I have watched her light up in every conversation she has had with you these past weeks. I have watched her ask about you when you are not even in the room. I believe, Miss Whitmore, that seeing you as my intended, even for a short time, even as an arrangement between us and no one else, would give her more peace than anything else I could offer her in the time she has left." The room felt suddenly very small. "You are asking me to pretend to be your bride." "I am asking for a kindness I have no right to ask, and I know it, and I am asking regardless because I am out of better ideas and running out of time." He took a step closer, and his voice dropped, quieter and more earnest than she had ever heard it. "I will pay whatever the shop needs. I will secure your father's future for good, not merely this season. In exchange, I ask only a few months of your time, an engagement in name, Nothing more, until my grandmother has had her wish and can rest easy." Alina stood very still, her mind turning over every reasonable objection she could think of, and finding that every single one of them was outweighed, entirely and completely, by the memory of the Dowager Duchess's sharp, kind eyes, and the grief already written plainly across her grandson's face. "And when it ends," Alina said carefully, "when the engagement is no longer needed, what happens then?" Something flickered across his face too quickly for her to read it clearly. "Then you will be free of it, with your father's shop secure and no obligation to me beyond what kindness you have already shown my family. I would not trap you in anything beyond what you agree to now." It should have been a simple answer. It should have settled the matter cleanly. Instead, for reasons Alina could not fully explain even to herself, it left a small, unexpected ache somewhere beneath her ribs, as though some part of her had wanted him to say something else entirely, something neither of them was yet ready to say aloud. "I will do it," she said, "for your grandmother's sake." Relief broke across his face, open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore, truly." "Alina," she said, before she could think better of it, "if we are to be engaged, even in pretense, you had better learn to use my given name." A slow smile crossed his face, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Alina, then, and you must call me Alexander, or the whole house will think our engagement a very poor performance indeed." Neither of them could have known, standing there in the quiet morning light with an old woman's failing heart hanging over every word between them, how quickly the performance would stop feeling like one at all. Alina moved into Ashford House on a gray Tuesday morning with 2 small trunks and a heart that would not stop racing. And by the time the sun set that first evening, she had already been corrected by 3 different members of staff for walking too quickly through the halls. A habit Alexander told her, with quiet amusement, that no proper lady of the house was ever supposed to have. "I have spent my whole life walking quickly," she told him over dinner that night, the two of them alone at a table far too large for 2 people, candlelight throwing long shadows against the walls. "There was always somewhere I needed to be. A delivery to make, a fitting to finish before the light failed." "Then we will simply have to teach you to walk as though you have nowhere in particular to be," Alexander said. "It is, I promise you, an easier habit to learn than it sounds." It was not, as it turned out, an easy habit to learn at all, but Alexander proved a patient teacher. And over the following days, a routine settled between them that Alina found herself looking forward to more than she was willing to admit. Mornings were spent with the housekeeper, learning which fork belonged to which course, how to address a viscount and how to address an earl, how to enter a room in a way that suggested confidence rather than the quick, purposeful stride of someone used to delivering parcels before the rain came. Afternoons, more often than not, were spent with Alexander himself. "You are doing it again," he told her one afternoon, watching her cross the drawing room to retrieve a book. "Walking as though the room is on fire." "I am trying." "Try slower." He crossed to her and after a brief hesitation that she noticed and did not comment on, offered his arm. "Here, walk beside me. It is easier to learn the pace of a room when you are not walking through it alone." She took his arm, and something about the warmth of it beneath her hand, the careful, deliberate slowness of his steps as he matched himself to what he was trying to teach her, made her chest go tight in a way that had nothing at all to do with the etiquette lesson. They walked the length of the drawing room twice, in silence, before he spoke again. "Better," he said quietly. "You have a natural grace, Alina. You simply have not been given the chance to use it before now." "You do not need to flatter me, Alexander. I know precisely what I am. A shopkeeper's daughter playing dress-up in a duke's house." "I was not flattering you." His voice had gone low and serious in a way that made her look up at him, and found his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I do not say things I do not mean." "Not to you." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them named, until the sound of the door opening broke it, and they stepped apart quickly as Mr. Pemberton entered to announce that the Dowager Duchess was awake and asking for company. They found her sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows, looking smaller than Alina remembered but no less sharp-eyed for it. She patted the edge of the bed in invitation, and Alina sat, while Alexander took the chair beside it. "You are learning quickly," the Duchess said, studying Alina's posture with obvious approval. "Better than I expected, and I expected a great deal, given how my grandson has been mooning about the house since you arrived." "I have not been mooning," Alexander said, with the particular flatness of a man who knew protesting too much would only make things worse. "You have been mooning terribly, and I am delighted by it." The Duchess's eyes sparkled with something that looked suspiciously like mischief, an odd contrast to the frailty of her hands where they rested against the coverlet. "I have not seen you smile this much in years, Alexander. Not since before your father died, and left you with all this responsibility far too young." A shadow crossed Alexander's face at the mention of his father, gone as quickly as it came, though Alina noticed it, and filed it away as something she wanted to ask about later when they were alone. "I am glad it pleases you, grandmother." "It pleases me a great deal. Now go and fetch me tea, both of you, and do try not to hover in the hallway pretending you are not standing closer together than propriety strictly allows. I may be old, but I am not blind." They left the room laughing, a real laugh, the first one Alina had shared with him without any performance in it at all, and it was only once they were alone in the corridor that she realized how easily the pretense had begun to slip, how naturally she had begun to reach for his arm without thinking, how much she had begun to look forward to the small, ordinary moments of their invented engagement. It frightened her a little how easily it had happened. That evening, after the Duchess had settled for the night and the house had gone quiet, Alina found Alexander in the library, a single lamp burning low against the darkness, a stack of estate papers forgotten in front of him while he stared instead at nothing in particular. "You are not working," she observed, stepping into the room. "I am thinking." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, and she took it, curling her feet beneath her in a way she never would have dared in the drawing room, but which felt entirely natural in the quiet privacy of the library. "About my father, mostly. My grandmother mentioning him tends to do that." "You do not have to tell me, if you would rather not." "I find oddly that I would rather tell you than not." He was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen over in his fingers. "He died when I was 22, an accident, riding home from town in bad weather. I inherited the title, the estate, the debts he had never told anyone about, all in the space of a single terrible week. I have spent every year since trying to prove I could carry it, that I was not simply a boy playing at being a duke." He looked up at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "My grandmother has watched me work myself half to death trying to prove that for 8 years. I think, more than anything, she wishes to see me happy before she goes, not merely competent." "And are you happy?" The question hung in the air between them, and Alina watched something shift in his face, a decision being made behind his eyes. "I am happier than I have been in a very long time," he said quietly. "Which frightens me rather more than it should, given the circumstances of our arrangement." She should have laughed it off, should have reminded him gently that it was, after all, only an arrangement, a kindness for his grandmother's sake and nothing more. Instead she found she could not say the words, could not pretend, even to herself, that the warmth spreading through her chest was anything other than exactly what it felt like. "It frightens me too," she admitted, so quietly she was not entirely sure he had heard her. He had. She saw it in the way his eyes softened, in the way he set down the pen he had been turning over and leaned forward slightly, as though drawn toward her without meaning to be. For a moment she thought he might say something more, might close the distance between them entirely, and her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Instead, he pulled back, visibly gathering himself, and gave her a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "It is late. You should rest. We have a long day of lessons tomorrow, and my grandmother will want a full report of your progress at breakfast, whether we like it or not." Alina rose, disappointment and relief tangled together in a way she did not fully understand, and made her way to the door. She paused there, looking back at him, still seated at his desk with the lamp casting gold light across his tired, thoughtful face. "Good night, Alexander." "Good night, Alina." She did not sleep well that night, turning the evening over and over in her mind, the closeness of him in the library, the unguarded honesty in his voice when he spoke of his father, the moment that had almost happened between them and then had not. She told herself it changed nothing, that they were still simply two people performing a kindness for a dying woman's peace of mind, and that whatever she felt stirring in her chest had no place in an arrangement that was, by its very design, meant to end. She did not yet know that Alexander lay awake in his own chamber for much the same reason, staring at his ceiling and wondering how he had ever convinced himself he could spend months pretending to love a woman he was already, quite hopelessly, beginning to love in truth. Neither of them said anything about it the next morning or the morning after that. But something had shifted between them in the quiet of that library, something neither of them could fully take back, and it would not stay hidden for very much longer. The knock at the drawing-room door came sharp and unannounced, and Alina looked up from the letter she had been practicing to find a woman standing in the doorway who had clearly not waited for Mr. Pemberton to introduce her. She was beautiful in the polished, deliberate way of someone who had spent a lifetime being told so, dressed in deep green silk that made her pale skin look almost luminous, her dark hair arranged in perfect curls that did not so much as tremble as she crossed the room with quick, purposeful steps. "So it is true," the woman said, stopping a few feet away and studying Alina with open, unhurried scrutiny. "Alexander really has engaged himself to a seamstress. I did not believe the rumor when I first heard it. I confess I am not certain I believe it now, looking at you." Alina rose, keeping her expression carefully neutral despite the sharp flutter of unease in her chest. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "Lady Cordelia Ashworth." She said it as though the name alone should explain everything, and in a household as steeped in old alliances as this one, it very nearly did. "Alexander and I have known each other since childhood. Our families always assumed we would marry, until quite recently, when he apparently decided he preferred a shop girl instead." Her eyes swept over Alina's plain but well-made dress with a coolness that made the insult clear without a single raised word. "How resourceful of you to have caught his attention. Was it the sewing that did it? Men do so love a woman who is useful. If you have come to see Alexander, Lady Cordelia, I am afraid he is out with the estate steward this morning." "I did not come to see Alexander." Cordelia's smile did not reach her eyes. "I came to see you. I thought it only fair to warn you woman to woman before you embarrass yourself further. Men like Alexander do not marry women like you. They admire them, perhaps, for a season, the way one admires a clever piece of embroidery. But when the time comes to actually choose a wife, to actually build a life and a legacy, they choose someone who understands the world they were born into. Someone who will not shame them at a dinner table full of people who have known real power for generations." Alina's pulse was pounding, but she kept her voice steady, refusing to give this woman the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "Alexander has never once made me feel ashamed of where I come from. I would ask that you extend me the same courtesy." Something flickered across Cordelia's composed face, a flash of genuine anger quickly smoothed away. "You misunderstand me. I am not trying to shame you. I am trying to save you from a heartbreak you cannot yet see coming. This engagement of yours will not last past his grandmother's passing, mark my words. And when it ends, you will be left with nothing, while I will still be here, exactly where I have always belonged, waiting for him to remember where his duty truly lies." She left as abruptly as she had arrived, the door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam, and Alina sank back into her chair, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. She did not tell Alexander about the visit, not at first. She told herself it was because the engagement was a pretense and Cordelia's warning, however cruelly delivered, was not entirely wrong. The arrangement was meant to end, and when it did, Alina would return to her father's shop and her ordinary life, and Alexander would eventually marry someone suited to his world in truth. It was foolish to be wounded by a stranger, simply confirming what she had always known. But the word stayed with her all the same, a small cold seed of doubt planted exactly where her growing feelings for him had begun to take root. And over the following days, she found herself watching him more carefully, searching for signs of the boredom or the regret that Cordelia had promised would eventually surface. She found none. If anything, Alexander seemed to grow more attentive with each passing day, seeking her out in the mornings before his correspondence, walking with her in the gardens in the evenings when the Duchess had retired, finding small excuses to touch her hand or her elbow that had nothing to do with etiquette lessons, and everything to do with something neither of them had yet found the courage to name. It was Mr. Pemberton, of all people, who finally told him about Cordelia's visit, mentioning it in passing while discussing the week's callers, and Alexander's expression darkened in a way Alina had never seen from him before. "She came here to speak to you, alone." His jaw tightened. "What did she say to you, Alina?" "It does not matter." "It matters a great deal if it is the reason you have been quieter than usual all week." He crossed the room to where she sat, kneeling in front of her chair so that their eyes were level, an intimacy that made her breath catch even in the midst of her discomfort. "Tell me." She told him, haltingly at first and then in a rush, the whole conversation, the sharp condescension, the warning about heartbreak, the certainty in Cordelia's voice that the engagement would end, and Alina would be left with nothing, while Cordelia remained exactly where she believed she belonged. By the time she finished, Alexander's expression had gone from anger to something quieter and more determined. "She had no right to say any of that to you." "She was not entirely wrong, Alexander. This engagement was never meant to last. I have always known that. That is not the same thing as being nothing to me when it ends." He took her hands in both of his thumbs tracing gently over her knuckles, and the tenderness of the gesture made her chest ache with a longing she had been trying and failing to suppress for weeks. "Alina, I need you to understand something. Whatever Cordelia believes about who I am meant to marry, whatever expectations my family or society may hold, I will not be told who I am permitted to care for. I have known Cordelia my whole life, and I have never once felt for her what I feel every single time I walk into a room and find you in it." Alina's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Alexander." "I am not finished," he said gently, and something in his voice, low and urgent and entirely sincere, stopped whatever protest she had been about to raise. "This arrangement began as a kindness for my grandmother's sake. I will not pretend otherwise. But it has become something else entirely, at least on my part, and I have been a coward for not telling you sooner, out of fear that you did not feel the same, or that telling you would ruin the ease we have built between us." He drew a breath, steadying himself. "I do not want this engagement to end when my grandmother's wish has been fulfilled. I want it to become real, if you will have me." The room seemed to hold its breath around them. Alina stared at him, at the raw honesty written plainly across his face, at the man who had pulled her from a wrecked carriage and remembered a torn coat sleeve for over a year, and had never once, in all the weeks since, made her feel like anything less than his equal, and felt something inside her chest break open with a relief so sharp it was almost painful. But even as her heart urged her forward, an old, practical fear held her back. The fear that Cordelia's cruelty had planted so effectively, the fear that this was a moment of feeling rather than a foundation for a lifetime, and that when the reality of society's judgment finally arrived in full force, it would not survive. "I need time," she said softly, and watched the hope in his face falter though he nodded, understanding, and did not press her further. "Not because I do not feel it too, Alexander. I do. But I have spent my whole life being told what people like me are and are not permitted to want, and I need to be certain, for my own sake as much as yours, before I let myself believe in something that could still be taken away." "Then I will wait," he said simply, "for as long as you need." He did not let go of her hands, and she did not pull away, and they sat like that in the quiet of the drawing room for a long while, neither of them speaking, both of them understanding that something had shifted between them that could not be undone, whatever came next. It was 2 days later that an invitation arrived for the Ashford family's annual masquerade ball, the grandest event of the season, where Alexander and Alina's engagement would be formally presented to society for the first time. Alina held the gilded card in her hands and felt, for the first time since accepting Alexander's original proposal, the full weight of what she had agreed to, and what it might mean to stand before all of society and be judged not as a shopkeeper's daughter delivering parcels through the back door, but as a duke's intended bride. Cordelia Ashworth, she had no doubt, would be there, and she would not come alone in her cruelty. The ballroom at Ashford House had been transformed beyond anything Alina could have imagined. Hundreds of candles glowing golden against silk drapery, musicians tuning their instruments in the gallery above, and a sea of masked guests already beginning to fill the grand entrance hall by the time she descended the staircase in a gown of deep sapphire blue that she herself had helped design, though the Duchess had insisted on choosing the color. Blue, the Duchess had said firmly, during their final fitting the week before. It matches his eyes when he looks at you, though I doubt either of you has noticed that yet. Alina had not known what to say to that, and said nothing, though she had thought of it every time she caught Alexander watching her since. Now standing at the top of the staircase with her mask in hand, a delicate thing of silver lace that left only her eyes and the lower half of her face visible, Alina felt her nerve waver for the first time since agreeing to the engagement. Below her, the hall was filled with people she did not know, people who had been born into wealth and title the way she had been born into thread and needle, and every one of them would be watching her tonight, measuring her, deciding whether she belonged. Alexander was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, unmasked for the moment, dressed in dark formal clothes that made him look every inch the Duke she had first mistaken him for in the rain, though the smile he gave her as she descended was entirely his own, warm and a little breathless, as though the sight of her had genuinely startled him. "You look extraordinary," he said quietly, offering his arm as she reached the final step. "I feel as though I am about to be thrown to wolves. Then I will simply have to make certain the wolves behave themselves." He tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow, steady and reassuring. "Stay close to me, enjoy the music. And do not let anyone convince you that you do not belong here tonight, because you do, and I intend to spend the entire evening proving it." The first hour passed more easily than she had feared. Alexander introduced her to a steady stream of guests, most of whom were polite if curious, several openly charmed by her once they discovered she had a sharp wit to match her composure. The Duchess held court from a chair near the fire, delighted to receive well-wishers and clearly enjoying every moment of watching Alina navigate the evening with growing confidence. It was during the third dance, a slow waltz that Alexander had taught her patiently over the preceding week, that Alina finally allowed herself to relax fully into the evening. His hand rested warm against her waist, his other hand clasping hers, and as they turned slowly beneath the candlelight, surrounded by dozens of other couples, it felt for a moment as though the entire crowded room had narrowed down to just the two of them. "You are smiling," Alexander said softly. "I did not expect to enjoy this so much." "Neither did I the first time I watched you cross a room without tripping over your own feet." He grinned at her indignant look. "I am teasing. You have become remarkably graceful, Alina, though I confess I am rather fond of the version of you who nearly fell into a ditch and refused to admit she needed help." "I did need help. I simply did not want to owe a duke anything. And now—" She met his eyes, steady beneath the golden light, and felt the words rise in her throat before she could stop them. "Now I find I do not mind owing you a great deal, Alexander Ashford." Something in his expression shifted, warm and unguarded, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, might close the small distance between them despite the crowded room around them. Instead, the music drew to its close, and they stepped apart amid polite applause, and the moment passed, though the warmth of it stayed with her for the rest of the dance. It was shortly after that Alina excused herself to find a moment of quiet on the terrace, the crowded ballroom growing warm despite the open windows, and it was there, beneath the cool night air and the distant sound of music drifting through the doors, that Cordelia Ashworth found her. She was dressed in deep crimson, her mask a striking piece of gilded silver, and she crossed the terrace with the same unhurried confidence she had shown during her visit to Ashford House weeks before. "You dance beautifully," Cordelia said without preamble. "I will give you that much. Alexander has taught you well." "Lady Cordelia, do not look so wary. I have not come to threaten you again." Cordelia leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the darkened gardens. "I have come instead to offer you a piece of honest advice, if you are willing to hear it." Alina said nothing, waiting, wary despite the other woman's apparent change in tone. "Everyone in that ballroom is asking the same question tonight," Cordelia said. "Whether this engagement of yours is real, or whether it is simply a passing fancy that Alexander will grow tired of once his grandmother's wish has been granted and the pressure to marry someone suitable returns in full force. I have watched him with you tonight, and I confess, against my own wishes, that I believe it may be real, at least for him." Her voice hardened slightly. "But real feeling is not enough to survive what is coming, Miss Whitmore. The moment word spreads beyond tonight's ball that Alexander intends to actually marry a tradesman's daughter, and not merely parade her about for a season of novelty, the full weight of society's disapproval will fall on you both. His peers will not simply gossip. They will act. Business partners will withdraw. Old alliances will sour. Doors that have been open to the Ashford name for generations will begin, quietly and deliberately, to close." She turned to face Alina fully, and for the first time there was no cruelty in her expression, only a kind of weary honesty. "I say this not because I wish you ill tonight, but because I have watched this world devour people who were not prepared for what it truly costs to defy it. Ask yourself honestly whether you are prepared to watch him lose everything he has spent his life building, for your sake." She left before Alina could formulate any response, disappearing back into the golden light and noise of the ballroom, and Alina stood alone on the terrace for a long moment, the cool night air doing nothing to settle the sudden storm of doubt in her chest. She was still standing there, lost in thought, when the terrace doors opened again and Alexander appeared, his expression immediately shifting to concern at the sight of her troubled face. "Alina, what has happened?" "Nothing," she tried to smile and failed. "I simply needed air." "You are a poor liar for someone who has spent months pretending to be my fiancé." He crossed to her, gentle but insistent. "Tell me." She told him reluctantly the substance of Cordelia's warning, watching his jaw tighten as she spoke, though he let her finish without interruption. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the dark gardens with an expression she could not quite read. "She is not entirely wrong," he said finally. "There will be difficulty. Some doors may close. Some old friends may prove not to have been friends at all once they learn the truth of who I intend to marry." He turned to face her fully. "But Alina, I did not spend 8 years rebuilding this family's fortune and reputation from the wreckage my father left behind simply to hand my happiness over to people who judge a person's worth by the calluses on her hands rather than the goodness of her heart. If society cannot make room for the woman I love, then I will build a smaller world that can, and I will consider it well built regardless of its size." The word landed between them before either of them seemed fully ready for it. Love. He had not meant to say it, she could tell by the way his own eyes widened slightly, as though the truth had simply outrun his caution. But he did not take it back. "I love you," he said again, more deliberately this time, closing the last small distance between them. "Not as a pretense, not as a kindness for my grandmother's sake, though it began that way and I will not pretend otherwise. I love you as myself, entirely and without reservation, and I have known it for weeks, and I am done being afraid to say it simply because the world might not approve." Alina's eyes stung with sudden tears, relief and fear and joy tangled together so tightly she could barely tell them apart. Alexander. Whatever she had been about to say was lost, because at that moment the ballroom doors burst open, and a cluster of guests spilled onto the terrace, laughing loudly, and among them, unmistakably, was Cordelia, her sharp eyes finding Alina and Alexander standing close together in the moonlight with an expression of open, undisguised triumph, as though she had orchestrated the interruption entirely on purpose. "There you both are," Cordelia said, her voice carrying easily to the small crowd behind her. "The whole ballroom is asking where the happy couple has disappeared to. Come, Alexander, your grandmother is asking for a toast." The moment shattered, though Alexander's hand found Alina's and held it firmly as they returned to the ballroom together. And if anything, his grip only tightened when Cordelia attempted, with practiced subtlety, to steer the conversation among the gathered guests toward pointed questions about Alina's family, her upbringing, the precise nature of a shopkeeper's daily labor. "You seem very interested in my history tonight, Lady Cordelia," Alina said finally, when the third such question had been asked in as many minutes, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her composure. "I would be happy to answer honestly, if you are equally willing to share why the subject interests you so particularly." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the small crowd, and Cordelia's composure flickered, just slightly, at being so neatly turned back on herself. "I only wonder," Cordelia pressed, undeterred, "whether a woman raised counting coins for mended hems truly understands what it means to manage an estate the size of Ashford's. It is rather more complicated than balancing a shop's ledger, I should think." "I have balanced ledgers where a single miscalculation meant my father, and I did not eat that week," Alina said quietly, and the room around them went very still. "I understand the value of every coin that passes through my hands better than most people born into wealth ever will, because I have known what it costs to be without it. I do not think that makes me unsuited to manage an estate, Lady Cordelia. I think it makes me rather better prepared than most." Alexander's hand tightened around hers, pride evident in every line of his expression, and even among the small crowd of onlookers, several murmured approval at Alina's steady, dignified response. Cordelia's face had gone tight with poorly concealed frustration, and she opened her mouth to press further, only for Alexander to step forward, his voice carrying clear and firm across the small gathering. "I would ask that no one address my intended in this manner again," he said, and though his tone remained perfectly civil, there was steel beneath it that silenced the group entirely. "Alina Whitmore has more genuine worth in her smallest finger than most of the people in this room possess in their entire fortunes, and I will not have her questioned as though her presence here requires justification. She has earned her place beside me many times over, and I intend to make certain the whole of society understands that, beginning tonight." He turned to Alina then, and in front of the assembled guests, in front of Cordelia's stunned, furious silence, he raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that needed no further words to explain itself. The whispers that followed them for the rest of the evening were no longer whispers of doubt, but of a different kind entirely, the unmistakable murmur of a room that had just witnessed something real, however unexpected its origins, and could not help but be moved by it. Alina did not see Cordelia again for the remainder of the night. But she carried the woman's earlier warning with her all the same, tucked beneath the joy of the evening like a small, cold stone, and wondered, even as Alexander held her close for one final dance beneath the candlelight, how much of society's disapproval they would truly have to weather before this fragile, precious thing between them was allowed to simply exist in peace. The morning after the ball, Alina woke late, her body still humming with the memory of candlelight and Alexander's voice, saying "I love you" as though the words had been waiting years to be spoken. She dressed quickly, eager to find him, and it was on her way to the breakfast room that she overheard a conversation through the half-open door of Alexander's study that stopped her cold in the corridor. "The full amount was settled some 3 weeks before you asked me to draw up the engagement papers, Your Grace," a man's voice was saying, precise and businesslike, the tone of a solicitor discussing accounts. "Whitmore's debts, the shop lease, the outstanding balance with the fabric merchants in town, all of it cleared quietly before Miss Whitmore had any notion of the arrangement you intended to propose to her." Alina went very still, her hand hovering just above the door, her breath caught somewhere in her throat. I am aware of the timeline, Mr. Bennet, Alexander's voice replied, calm but with an edge of something guarded beneath it. I do not need it recited back to me. I only mention it, Your Grace, because it is somewhat unusual, is it not, to clear a family's entire financial burden before securing any formal agreement in return. Most men in your position would have made the settlement contingent on the engagement itself. You did the opposite. You gave first and asked after. There was a long pause before Alexander answered, and when he did, his voice had gone quiet in a way that made Alina's chest ache even before she understood why. I did not want her agreeing to anything out of desperation, he said finally. I wanted the choice to be entirely hers, free of any pressure I might have placed on her by holding her father's ruin over her head as leverage. If she had refused me, I would still have wanted her family safe. That was never meant to be conditional on anything she gave me in return. Alina's eyes burned with sudden tears, understanding crashing over her all at once. He had cleared her father's debts, all of them, weeks before he ever asked her to pretend to be his bride, with no guarantee she would agree to anything at all. The arrangement, she had told herself, was purely transactional, a fair exchange freely entered into by two consenting parties, had never been transactional in his mind, not truly. He had given everything first, asking nothing, hoping only that she might come to care for him in time, entirely on her own terms. She pushed the door open before she could think better of it, and both men turned, startled, Alexander's expression shifting quickly from surprise to something like wariness as he took in her face. Alina, how much of that did you hear? Enough, her voice shook, though not with anger, not entirely. You paid everything, all of it, before you ever asked me to agree to this engagement. The solicitor, sensing the private nature of what was about to unfold, gathered his papers quickly and excused himself, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet study, morning light slanting through the tall windows. Why did you not tell me? Alina asked once the door had closed. Because I did not want you to feel as though you owed me anything for it, Alexander said quietly, rising from behind his desk to face her properly. I did not want gratitude standing between us where I hoped, eventually, something else might grow instead. I know how proud you are, Alina. I knew if you understood the full truth of what I had done, you would either refuse the engagement outright, believing yourself indebted, or you would agree to it out of obligation rather than genuine willingness. I could not bear either outcome. So you let me believe our arrangement was purely practical, a fair trade, my performance as your bride in exchange for my father's security. I let you believe what was easiest for you to accept at the time, he admitted. It was not entirely honest of me, and I am sorry for that. But Alina, I promise you, my reasons were never as calculating as they may now appear. I paid off your father's debts because I could not bear the thought of your family suffering when I had the means to prevent it, regardless of whether you ever looked twice at me. Everything that came after, the engagement, the lessons, the ball last night, was born from something entirely separate. From wanting you near me, for reasons that had nothing to do with my grandmother's wishes at all, though I used her illness as the excuse I needed to ask you properly. Alina stared at him, a dozen conflicting emotions warring in her chest. There was tenderness, unmistakable, at the depth of quiet generosity he had shown her without ever asking for acknowledgement. But there was also a sharp, unsettling fear, the same fear Cordelia's warnings had planted weeks before, now given new and troubling shape. If he had been capable of hiding something this significant, this fundamental to the honesty of their arrangement, what else might he be capable of concealing, however well-intentioned his reasons? I do not know what to feel, she admitted quietly. I am grateful, Alexander, truly. My father's future, the shop's survival, all of it secured before I even knew to ask for it. But I am also frightened because I built whatever trust exists between us on the belief that I understood the full shape of our arrangement, and I did not. You kept something enormous from me, however kindly intended, and I do not know how to be certain there is nothing else. There is nothing else, he said immediately, urgently, closing the distance between them. Alina, I swear to you, there is nothing else hidden. I have told you everything now, the whole of it, and I will answer any question you have honestly for as long as you need me to." "I need time," she said, echoing the same words she had spoken to him weeks before in the drawing room, though her voice carried a different weight now, less certain, more shaken. "I need to think, Alexander." "Please." He let her go, though the pain in his eyes as she left the study was plain enough that it followed her through the rest of the day. A quiet ache she could not fully shake no matter how she tried to occupy her thoughts elsewhere. She spent the afternoon in the garden, walking the same paths where Alexander had taught her the slow, unhurried pace of a lady with nowhere in particular to be, turning the morning's revelation over and over in her mind. She thought of her father, safe now in the shop that would have been lost without Alexander's quiet, unconditional generosity. She thought of the Dowager Duchess growing weaker by the week, whose genuine happiness at Alina's presence had never once felt like performance, not from the old woman's side of things, whatever the arrangement had originally been on paper. She thought of Cordelia's warnings, of the cost society might yet demand of them both, and wondered whether the doubt currently sitting heavy in her chest was wisdom or simply fear finding a new excuse to take root. It was the Duchess who found her there, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, wrapped in shawls despite the mild afternoon, settling onto the garden bench beside Alina with obvious effort. "You look troubled," the Duchess observed, "and Alexander looked considerably worse than troubled when I passed his study an hour ago. Will you tell an old woman what has happened, or must I guess?" Alina told her, haltingly, the whole of it, the overheard conversation, the debts settled weeks before any proposal had been made, the fear that had followed the discovery despite the evident generosity behind it. The Duchess listened without interruption, her sharp eyes fixed thoughtfully on the middle distance, until Alina had finished. "May I tell you something about my grandson?" the Duchess said finally, "that he has likely never told you himself because he does not think of it as significant, though I have always believed it explains him entirely." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "When his father died, Alexander was 22, as he has likely told you, and utterly unprepared for the weight that fell on him. What he has perhaps not told you is that his father left this family drowning in debt, hidden for years behind a good name and expensive appearances, the kind of quiet ruin that destroys families slowly rather than all at once. Alexander spent years, Alina, years, working in near secrecy to repair what his father had broken, refusing help from anyone, insisting on carrying the burden entirely alone because he had watched his father's pride, and his father's silence very nearly destroy everything this family had built. He swore, I know for a fact, that he would never again let someone he loved suffer silently under a debt they did not know existed, the way his own mother suffered for years without understanding the true state of her husband's finances until it was very nearly too late." The Duchess turned to look at Alina directly, her sharp eyes softened now with something like tenderness. "When he cleared your father's debts before ever asking anything of you, I do not believe he was hiding a manipulation, my dear. I believe he was trying, in the only way he knew how, to give you the one thing his own mother was never given. Security freely offered, with no strings attached and no obligation demanded in return." Alina's eyes filled with sudden tears, the whole shape of Alexander's actions rearranging themselves in her mind into something far more tender, far more wounded and hopeful at once, than she had allowed herself to see that morning. "I have been unfair to him," she said quietly. "You have been afraid," the Duchess corrected gently. "There is a difference, though I grant the two often look identical from the outside. Fear makes us search for betrayal in places where there is only imperfect love trying its clumsy best." She patted Alina's hand with her thin, cool fingers. "Go and find him, child. Do not let pride or fear cost either of you what little time some of us have left to see it resolved." Alina found Alexander exactly where she expected to, back in his study, though he was not working, simply sitting with his head in his hands, the picture of a man who had spent the entire afternoon rehearsing apologies he was not certain would be accepted. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face braced immediately for whatever she had come to say. Your grandmother told me about your father, Elena said quietly, closing the door behind her. About the debts he hid, about your mother, about everything you swore you would never let happen to someone you loved. Alexander's expression flickered with surprise, and something rower beneath it. She should not have told you that. She was right to tell me. Elena crossed the room and knelt in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers the way he had once taken hers in the drawing room, weeks ago, when he had first admitted the arrangement had become something more. I was afraid this morning, Alexander. I let old fears convince me that kindness kept secret must be hiding something worse beneath it. I am sorry for the doubt, when what you actually gave me was the very opposite of manipulation. It was the truest kind of love, offered with nothing expected in return. I should have told you from the beginning, he said, his voice rough. I let my own fear of your reaction keep me from being fully honest, and that fear cost us both an afternoon of pain that did not need to happen. Then let us agree, Elena said softly, that whatever comes next we tell each other everything. No more kept secrets, however well-intentioned. I do not need protecting from difficult truths, Alexander. I need only to be trusted with them. I promise, he said, and the sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. Everything always from now on. He drew her up from where she knelt and into his arms, and she let herself be held, the last of the morning's fear finally dissolving into something steadier and more certain than it had ever been before. Outside the study window, the afternoon light was beginning to soften toward evening, and somewhere in the house the Dowager Duchess was resting, satisfied, having done what small good she could to mend what fear had briefly threatened to break. The Dowager Duchess took a turn for the worse on a quiet Sunday evening, and by the time the physician arrived, her breathing had grown shallow enough that he did not bother pretending optimism he did not feel. Alexander sat at her bedside through the night, Elena beside him, holding his hand as the candles burned low, and the old woman drifted in and out of a thin, fragile sleep. Near dawn, the Duchess opened her eyes fully, lucid and clear in a way she had not been for days, and reached for both their hands at once. I have something to confess, she said, her voice thin but steady, before I am too tired to say it properly. Grandmother, you should rest. I will rest soon enough, Alexander, for a very long time. Let me speak while I still can. She squeezed their hands with surprising strength. I have known from the very beginning that your engagement was not real, not truly. I am old, my dear boy, not foolish, and I recognized the shape of a kindness dressed up as a love match the moment you first brought her to see me. Her eyes moved to Elena, soft with something like gratitude. I let you both believe I was deceived because I hoped, watching the two of you together, that the pretense might grow into something honest before I was gone. And it has. I have watched it happen with my own eyes, week by week, and I could not have asked for a finer gift in my final months than watching my grandson fall in love, truly and completely, with a woman who loves him not for his title, but for the man beneath it. Elena's eyes filled with tears, and beside her, Alexander's composure finally broke, his shoulders shaking silently as he pressed his grandmother's hand to his forehead. I am not sorry for any of it, the Duchess continued, her voice growing fainter but her words no less deliberate. Not the scheme, not the secrecy, not the small mischiefs I indulged in along the way to push you both a little closer together than you might otherwise have managed on your own. I only ask one thing of you now, while I still have breath enough to ask it. Anything, Alexander said, his voice thick. Marry her properly, the Duchess said. Not for my sake this time, not for any performance or any pretense. Marry her because she is the finest thing that has happened to this family in a generation, and because I have watched you become a better man simply by loving her honestly. Promise me that, and I will go peacefully, knowing this family is in good hands at last. I promise, Alexander said, and Elena, unable to speak through her own tears, simply nodded, pressing the old woman's frail hand between both of her own. The Duchess smiled, a real smile, peaceful and unafraid, and closed her eyes once more, her breathing growing softer and slower until, sometime in the quiet hour just before sunrise, it stopped altogether gently without struggle, exactly as she had wished. The days that followed passed in a blur of grief and quiet ceremony, the household draped in mourning, the halls of Ashford House unusually silent without the old woman's sharp wit and sharper opinions echoing through them. Alina stayed close to Alexander throughout, managing what small comfort she could, and found, in the process of grieving alongside him, that whatever doubts had once lingered about her place in his world had entirely dissolved, replaced by a certainty that had nothing left to do with pretense of any kind. It was Cordelia, unexpectedly, who called at the house during the period of mourning, dressed in respectful black, her usual sharpness softened by what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I came to offer my condolences," she said. When Alina received her in the drawing-room, Alexander occupied elsewhere with matters of the estate. "The Duchess was, whatever else might be said of our history, a woman I genuinely admired. She did not suffer fools, and she never once pretended to like me simply because our families expected a match between Alexander and myself. I respected her honesty, even when it stung." "Thank you for coming," Alina said carefully, still wary despite the softened tone. "I owe you an apology as well," Cordelia said, surprising her further. "I said cruel things to you, at the ball and before it, out of my own wounded pride more than any genuine belief that you were unsuited to him. I watched you handle every insult I offered with more grace than I have managed in years of practiced composure, and I watched Alexander look at you the way he has never once looked at me, in all the years our families hoped for a match. It took his grandmother's passing, oddly enough, to make me see clearly what should have been obvious from the start. You are not a passing fancy he will grow tired of, Miss Whitmore. You are the woman he was always meant to find, whatever unlikely circumstances brought the two of you together." "That is generous of you to say." "It is honest of me to say, which is a rarer thing in my case." Cordelia allowed herself a small, wry smile. "I do not expect us to become close friends, Miss Whitmore, but I no longer intend to stand as any obstacle between you and the happiness you have clearly found. Society will gossip regardless, as it always does. Let it gossip about a rival who conceded gracefully, rather than one who made a fool of herself trying to prevent the inevitable." She left with a final, almost genuine nod of respect, and Alina watched her go, feeling something settle in her chest that she had not realized was still unsettled. The last lingering thread of doubt Cordelia's earlier cruelty had planted, finally, fully, put to rest. Alexander found her still standing in the drawing-room a few minutes later, and she told him of the unexpected visit, watching surprise and quiet relief move across his face in equal measure. "I did not expect that from her," he admitted. "Neither did I. But I think, in her own way, she has been carrying her own kind of grief this whole time, watching a future she had always assumed was her slip away to someone she never saw coming." Alina reached for his hand. "I do not think we need to fear her any longer, Alexander. Whatever comes next, I believe we will face it without that particular shadow hanging over us." He drew her close, resting his forehead against hers in the quiet, grieving stillness of the house that had, against every unlikely odd, become entirely her home. "There is still society to contend with," he said softly. "Still doors that may close, still whispers that will follow us for longer than either of us would like. My grandmother's blessing does not erase every difficulty ahead." "No," Alina agreed. "But I have already survived worse than whispers, Alexander. I have survived hunger and debt, and the fear of losing everything my father built with his own 2 hands. I think, together, we can survive a few closed doors and a season or 2 of gossip, if it means we get to build something honest on the other side of it." He kissed her then, gently, in the quiet drawing-room where their pretense had first begun to unravel into something real, and neither of them doubted, any longer, that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything else since the night a carriage wheel broke on a rain-soaked road together, and without pretense of any kind. The wedding took place on a bright autumn morning, 6 months after the Dowager Duchess had been laid to rest beside her husband in the family chapel, the same chapel now filled with late-season flowers and warm sunlight streaming through tall windows onto rows of gathered guests. Alina stood in the small antechamber beforehand, dressed in ivory silk of her own design, her hands steady despite the fluttering nerves in her chest, and studied her reflection in the tall mirror with something like disbelief. It hardly seemed possible that the woman looking back at her, poised and radiant in a gown fit for a duchess, was the same girl who had once delivered mended parcels through the servants' entrance of this very estate, never imagining she would one day walk through its front doors as its mistress. Her father stood beside her, dressed in his finest coat, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief he had clearly forgotten to hide in his pocket. "Your mother would have loved this," Edmund Whitmore said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said you had more grace in you than you knew, hidden under all that practicality. I only wish she were here to see how right she was." "She is here, Papa," Alina said softly, squeezing his arm, "in every stitch of this gown. I made certain of it." He laughed, wet and warm, and offered her his arm, and together they walked from the antechamber toward the chapel doors, where the sound of gathered voices and soft music drifted out to meet them. The chapel fell silent as she entered, every head turning, but Alina found she did not care for the weight of their attention, not truly, because the only gaze that mattered to her was waiting at the end of the aisle, where Alexander stood in formal dress, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen him allow in public, tears already gathering at the corners of his gray eyes as he watched her walk toward him. She thought, as she made her way slowly down the aisle on her father's arm, of everything that had brought her to this moment. The broken carriage wheel on a rain-soaked road, the torn coat sleeve he had remembered for over a year, the desperate, generous scheme born of a dying woman's wish, and the quiet, unconditional kindness hidden beneath it that had taken her far too long to fully understand. The masquerade ball and Cordelia's warnings, and the fear those warnings had planted that had very nearly cost them both something precious before they learned to trust each other completely. The Duchess's final blessing, given not out of obligation, but out of genuine, delighted love for the granddaughter she had chosen to claim in her final months. None of it had been simple. None of it had followed any path either of them could have predicted, standing in the rain that first night, strangers to one another beyond a single remembered kindness. But every difficult, uncertain step had led here, to this chapel filled with autumn light, to a man who had never once, from the very beginning, meant anything less than the whole of his heart when he asked her to pretend. When her father placed her hand in Alexander's at the altar, Alina felt the same warmth she had first felt on that rain-soaked road months ago, steady and certain and entirely real, and knew, without any lingering doubt, that whatever pretense had once existed between them had long since been replaced by something far more lasting. "I love you," Alexander murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear it, as the vicar began the ceremony. "I have loved you since long before I ever asked you to pretend otherwise, and I will go on loving you honestly and completely for the whole of my life." "I know," Alina whispered back, smiling through sudden tears. "I have known for some time now. I simply needed the courage to believe it was truly mine to keep." They exchanged their vows beneath the golden autumn light, promises spoken plainly and without pretense, and when Alexander finally kissed his bride before the assembled guests, the applause that followed carried none of the doubt or judgment either of them had once feared, only genuine warmth, for a love that had proven, against every unlikely odd, to be exactly as real as it had first quietly, secretly begun. Outside the chapel, as the newly married couple made their way through a shower of flower petals toward the waiting carriage, Alina caught sight of her father's shop sign, newly repainted and prosperous, glimpsed through the trees where the estate met the town road, a quiet reminder of everything that had been saved, and everything that had been found in the months since a duke had first pulled a stranger from a wrecked carriage in the rain. She had come to Ashford House as a pretend bride, hired to ease an old woman's final months with a comfortable lie. She left the chapel that autumn morning as Alexander's true and lasting wife, chosen not out of duty or convenience, but out of a love that had grown slowly, honestly, and entirely on its own terms, exactly as the Dowager Duchess had always hoped it would. and as the carriage carried them away from the chapel toward the beginning of their real life together, Alina rested her head against Alexander's shoulder and thought, with quiet certainty, that every difficult step of the journey had been worth it, every single time, to arrive at this one honest, unshakable truth. He had meant every word he ever said to her, from the very first night in the rain, and he would go on meaning every word for the rest of their days. Winter settled over Ashford House within weeks of the wedding, and with it came a new rhythm to Alina's days that she had not expected but quickly grew to treasure. She did not abandon her needle and thread simply because she now wore a duchess's title. Instead, with Alexander's full support, she transformed a bright, unused room on the ground floor into a proper workshop, where she continued designing gowns for the household, and before long, for several curious noblewomen who had heard whispers of the new duchess's remarkable skill and wished to see it for themselves. Her father's shop thrived under the steady patronage that followed, and Edmund Whitmore, though he insisted on continuing to work well past the age most men would have retired, took on 2 apprentices that winter to help manage the growing demand. Alina visited often, still walking the familiar road between the shop and the estate, though now in a carriage of her own rather than on foot through the mud, and she found that the 2 halves of her life, the one she had been born into and the one she had married into, no longer felt like separate worlds at all, but simply different rooms in the same full and generous life. Alexander, for his part, found himself changed in ways he had not anticipated when he first proposed the pretense that had brought them together. The estate steward remarked, more than once, that his grace had grown noticeably less severe in his dealings with the tenant farmers, more willing to listen before deciding, more patient with the small disputes and requests that had once seemed to weigh on him as burdens rather than responsibilities. Alina liked to think that some of her father's steady, practical kindness had rubbed off on him, the same quiet fairness that had kept a struggling shop honest, even when honesty cost them coin they could not spare. It was on a cold morning in late January, nearly 4 months into their marriage, that Alina woke feeling unusually unwell, a queasiness that lingered well past breakfast and left her pale and quiet at a time of day she was normally at her most industrious. Alexander noticed immediately, his concern sharpening into something close to alarm by midday, when she declined a second attempt at breakfast entirely. "You have been unwell for 3 mornings now," he said, finding her resting in the drawing-room that afternoon, a cup of tea untouched beside her. "I am sending for the physician." "Alexander, it is likely nothing more than a passing chill." "It is not nothing to me," he said firmly, already moving toward the bell-pull, and Alina, too tired to argue further, let him have his way. The physician arrived within the hour, examined her with brisk professionalism, and delivered his verdict with a small, knowing smile that Alina did not immediately understand, though Alexander, watching the doctor's face, seemed to grasp the meaning a moment before she did. "Your Grace," the physician said, addressing Alexander directly, though his eyes moved warmly to Alina as well, "I believe congratulations are in order. The Duchess is not unwell. She is, unless I am very much mistaken, some 6 weeks along." The room went very quiet. Alina stared at the physician, then at Alexander, whose face had gone through an entire journey of emotion in the space of a few seconds, shock giving way to disbelief, and disbelief giving way, finally, to a joy so open and unguarded that Alina felt her own eyes fill with sudden tears simply from watching it unfold across his features. "A child," Alexander said softly, as though testing the words for the first time. "We are to have a child." "It would appear so, Your Grace," the physician said, gathering his instruments with the satisfied air of a man who enjoyed delivering good news far more often than bad. "I would recommend rest, and perhaps a reduction in the more strenuous of the Duchess's activities in the workshop, though I suspect that particular battle will be yours to fight, not mine." He left them alone, and Alexander crossed the room immediately, kneeling beside her chair the way he had once knelt to ask about Cordelia's cruel visit, though the expression on his face now held nothing but wonder. "Are you well?" he asked. "Truly well? I do not wish you to hide anything from me, not even a little discomfort, not ever again." "I am well," Alina said, laughing through her tears. "Better than well, Alexander. I am happier than I have ever been in my entire life." She placed his hand gently against her still flat stomach, marveling at the reality of it herself. "We are going to have a child. A child who will grow up knowing precisely where his mother came from," Alexander said quietly, his voice thick with feeling, "and precisely how much strength and grace it took to build the life she built, long before any of us were fortunate enough to become part of it." News of the coming child spread through the household with predictable speed and delight, and by the following week, even the more distant corners of society had heard whispers of the happy news, whispers that carried none of the old skepticism or judgment that had once followed Alina's name. She had over the preceding months proven herself so thoroughly, in matters both large and small, that even those who had once doubted the wisdom of the match found themselves, somewhat to their own surprise, genuinely pleased for the couple. Cordelia sent a brief, gracious note of congratulations that spring, mentioning, almost in passing, that she had recently accepted the courtship of a viscount she had known for some years, a man who, in her own words, valued her company for precisely who she was rather than for who her family expected her to become. Alina read the note twice, smiled, and set it aside with a warmth she would not have believed possible a year earlier, glad that whatever bitterness had once existed between them had finally been allowed to soften into something like genuine goodwill. The child, a daughter, was born on a warm morning in early autumn, almost exactly 1 year after Alina had first climbed the staircase at Ashford House to marry the man she had once agreed only to pretend to love. They named her Margaret, after the Dowager Duchess, and Alina liked to imagine, in the quiet hours she spent rocking her daughter to sleep in the same sitting room where the old woman had once tested silks against the window light, and asked pointed, delighted questions about honesty and coin, that some small measure of that sharp, generous spirit had found its way into the newest member of the family. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask how her parents had first come to fall in love, Alina would tell her the story exactly as it had happened, without softening the parts that had once frightened her, without hiding the fear and doubt that had nearly kept her from the happiness she eventually found. She told her daughter of the broken carriage wheel, and the torn coat sleeve remembered for over a year, and the desperate, generous scheme born of a grandmother's dying wish that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, grown into something entirely real. "Your father asked me to pretend," Alina would say, smiling at the memory even after all the years between them, "and I very nearly refused him out of pride and fear, and the certainty that a man like him could never truly want a girl like me. But he meant every word he ever said from that very first night, long before either of us was brave enough to admit it plainly. Sometimes, my darling, the truest things in life begin as the smallest, most unlikely kindnesses, offered by people who have no idea yet how much they will come to mean to one another." And Alexander, listening from the doorway as he so often did during these evening tellings, would cross the room and take his wife's hand exactly as he had done on countless evenings before, in libraries and drawing rooms and quiet gardens across the many years of their marriage, and would say, as he always said, with the same quiet certainty that had first won her heart in a rain-soaked carriage so many years before, that he had never once, in the whole of their life together, regretted a single word of that first desperate proposal, because it had given him the one thing he had never known he was missing until the moment she agreed to it. A love that had begun as pretense, and had become, in every honest sense that mattered, entirely and unshakably real.